Thank you very much for the invitation to present at this year's Conference for Court Administrations in Singapore. I'm very honored, and I'm also looking forward to the IACA conference, which will be held in Singapore in 2024. And I look forward to hopefully meeting you or seeing you there in person. My today's session will deal with the topic of people-centered justice, which is indeed the theme of the conference. And essentially, I would like to introduce you to the topic of people-centered justice from the point of view of a former scholar, court administrator, and also currently an international consultant in this area. Very briefly, I am an Australian court administration expert and scholar. I've worked at the Department of Justice in the area of the court services. I also established a number of people-centered justice courts in the city of Melbourne, specifically Mental Health Court and also the Koori Court. Also, I have 10 years of experience as a trial attorney or barrister, as we say in Australia and probably also in Singapore. Following that, I also completed a PhD in this area and was also a lecturer in law at RMIT University. I'm currently also a member of the IACA board and managing editor of the International Journal for Court Administration. Today's session will essentially, I will introduce you via three following topics. Firstly, I'll talk about in lay terms, so in plain English, as to what people-centered justice is. Then I'll briefly introduce a little bit of theory, just a couple of slides, no more, I promise, about people-centered justice theory and also the design approach. And finally, I'll briefly talk about the idea of the court's engagement with the community. And this is really the trickiest part. A lot of us know already that, you know, the premises and the entrances to the court need to be well designed, well lit, properly approachable or accessible to people with disabilities and so on and so forth. But the idea of the court's engagement with the community goes beyond the court system itself or beyond the court building itself. And this is something that I also wanted to highlight in today's presentation. But let's firstly introduce this idea of plain English definition of what people-centered justice is. Most of you will say, well, you know, that's when we need to put the court user at the forefront of our thinking when we are working in the courts. Well, that's true, but we need to give more content to that definition. And I've thought of this one. We need to, when we think about people-centered justice, we need to think about tailoring the premises, the procedures, perhaps even laws, services, relationships, and activities to the needs of court users and court communities. So this way you have a little bit of content to that definition, and start always, when you start thinking about people-centered justice, look at each of these elements and see whether there is something you can do in this area. Let's start with the premises. Have a look at this traditional courtroom design, which is prevalent in most countries. This particular one is obviously from a common law legal system. You can see that because of the wigs. Is that a good courtroom design or is it a bad courtroom design? Well, it depends. There is no set court design that really should be used for each court user. So for some types of proceedings, this may well be the most important and the most appropriate courtroom design. But you can see from the point of view of a court user that there seems to be an emphasis on legal side of it, on the people who are involved, the lawyers, the clerks, the bailiffs, the judge, above all, perched up there on the pedestal. So if you are for example, a single mother involved in some kind of a proceeding, you seem to be only a spectator in this showroom. You don't seem to be the main participant. Perhaps if you're a big bank or, you know, if it's some kind of a royal commission, this type of courtroom design may well be the most appropriate. But for certain types of participants, it will not be. And why? Because there's a lot of imbalances of power here between various different participants, and everything seems to be revolving around the court process itself. So how can we change it? Well, again, depends on the type of court users. First of all, you can see here, I've given you an example of a therapeutic jurisprudence courtroom, which have now become quite the norm in many countries. Here, you can't even tell who the judge is. Can you see how there is that imbalance of power between the judge and everyone else, and the lawyers and perhaps the participants being somewhere in the corner of the room, just watching the spectacle unfold. Here, everyone seems to be much more equal, and there seems to be a more participatory experience for the court user. Perhaps your court user can even bring a friend to assist them if they're feeling nervous. So again, imagine placing yourself in a position of someone who say has a mental impairment. This type of courtroom would be probably much better suited. The person would feel more comfortable, and indeed there wouldn't be as many power imbalances. Plus, you can see here we have some support services. It's not just the judge and the lawyers, but you can see there are perhaps some psychologists, maybe some therapists, maybe some medical personnel, and so on and so forth. The only person that is quite recognizable here perhaps is the police officer, but even there, that person has been provided with particular type of training to deal with these particular types of proceedings. So again, you can see here a very good example of a people-centered justice courtroom that is fully tailored to particular defendant. It's not just about the premises, but also the procedure can be amended quite significantly, so that, for example, the magistrate can adjourn the proceedings to receive certain reports, and then it can continue on for a little while. Each stage can be specifically designed, and even the sentencing options can be tailored. Another example is another example of similar courts is for indigenous people. This one uses similar sort of oval desk design, but in some respects it's quite similar also in terms of the procedure, because there are some slightly different sentencing options, but also the indigenous person who are in general quite disadvantaged in the Australian legal system can receive the support of an elder from their community. And also there is a Koori court officer who provides further assistance as a family support, and so on and so forth. So you can see that the entire courtroom design and proceeding is wrapped around your court user, rather than the court user being merely a spectator, like in the original example. What are we trying to achieve with all these interventions? Well, really, we're trying to avoid what is known in the human-centered design theory as a system design fail. Here we have an example of a design fail on the road, where a bike lane is designed inappropriately, or rather not the bike lane, but actually the water collector. The water collector box is designed in such a way that it's impossible to pass over it with a bike. Here we have another example. So think about these issues when you are designing your court processes. Are we doing something that is resulting in a court system design fail? Is this completely inappropriate design for this type of proceeding? And I'll also introduce you to this theory of human-centered design, which talks about 5 levers of human-centered design. It's centered around the so-called 5 Ps. And as I said, the layman's definition is that people-centered justice is about tailoring procedures, premises, services, laws, relationship, activities to court users. The theory of human-centered design refers to place, process, people, purposes, and planet. It's easier to remember, perhaps, in some ways. So thinking about your place, how is the entrance looking? What's the courtroom design like? What's the signage looking like? How are the services organized? What about the process, the security screening, the legal procedure, the court rituals and services, and so on and so forth? And most important, to think about the people, the relationship with court staff, judges, security, lawyers, court users, and the wider community. And now I'm going to introduce you to that very important element of people-centered design, which is thinking about what is your purpose. Well, traditionally, as you know, courts see themselves as having the purpose of dispensing justice, but actually they're not just doing that, they're also there to serve the community. Finally, think about the planet, because ultimately the court system is not there just for you and your generation, but for future generations as well. We need to think about how the court operations are impacting the future generations' ability to use the court and more broadly, the planet itself. Okay, let me take you through some ideas. Firstly, here we have the idea that the premises and also the procedures need to be designed with the court user in mind. You need to really think about how we can evaluate the experience of court users at every user's touch point with the court system. Perhaps it starts at the entrance, but perhaps even earlier, maybe even at the parking lot to your courthouse. Here we have an example of a very heavy security presence in front of a court, and immediately people who are coming to the court will feel intimidated. They will feel this is that place where I need to feel fear. Well, we should really try to redesign the experience of court users at every touch point. Yes, security needs to be there, but it can be organized in such a way that it is tucked away in somewhere else, so that it doesn't feel so overbearing. So think about these issues when you are trying to improve your existing design of security design and so on and so forth. What else you can do is actually try to flip the assumption. The idea that seeing the dogs, security dogs at the entrance of the courthouse can be really flipped altogether. Here is an example of an initiative at the Penrith Courthouse where they used the so-called therapy dogs at the entrance to the courthouse to show the people that, hey, this is a great place. It's a place where you can have fun, not just stress and not just to feel intimidated. Indeed, you can think about other touch points in your court system. Specifically, you need to really focus on vulnerable court users. In this case, we have a small child giving evidence in court proceedings. And why not use a dog to make that child feel comfortable and warm when giving evidence in distressing proceedings? But it goes beyond the courtroom. It goes outside of the courtroom as well. It goes even to the prison. Here we have on the left-hand side maximum security prison in many jurisdictions where inmates are led to sleep on concrete beds and so on and so forth. It's rather inhumane, no matter how bad the crime was, really. And indeed, recidivism rates in many jurisdictions will be 40 to 50%. Whereas if you have a look at this hotel-style treatment, perhaps it can be viewed as being a bit over the top. But in Norway, the recidivism rate is only 20%. So what I'm trying to say is you don't need to harshly treat your court users or people who go through the court system to achieve a good recidivism rate, better rates of recidivism, lower rate recidivism than in most other countries. So think about all of these issues in your everyday practice. So what is this all about? Well, let me tell you. Why are we doing this? Well, we're basically trying to adapt our premises and those 5 Ps to achieve greater trust between us and our court users and community, because every user interaction with the courts either enhances or erodes trust. Conversely, if there is a lack of trust, that also reduces people's confidence in the legal system and the outcomes that legal system produces. So that's why people-centered justice is critical to actually improving trust between the courts and court users community. And now I'll just very briefly talk about that final aspect that often is missing between in the court system, between the courts and the community. As I said, people-centered justice is not just about the court building and the process that happens during the trials. It goes beyond. We need to think about how can we integrate our courtroom with the community in other ways, in social ways, in other supportive ways, so that the courthouse is no longer seen as that place where litigation happens, as that place where fear happens, as that place where important decisions about our lives are being made, but also as a place where community can come to and congregate, maybe even have fun. Imagine that. So in Australia and in some other jurisdictions, we're actually doing a lot of this work in Georgia and other developing countries. Courts are starting to design their premises or use their premises to interact with community service organizations, to bring in community service organization, give them space to operate from the courts, either during hours, if there's enough space at the court, or even after hours. Why not give the courts the access to the courts to selected community service organizations who may need that space and who would be able to assist your court users outside of court hours. It could be, for example, women's shelters services, psychologist services, financial counseling services, refugee services, and so on and so forth. Really, opportunities are quite limitless when you start thinking about these ideas. And why not also use your court as a means of bringing the community to the courtroom on days when the courts are not open, or even when they are open. For example, using areas of the court as venues for an exhibition, community exhibition. Have a look at the photo on the right. This is an exhibition at the Neighbourhood Justice Centre in Melbourne. It's a community-based court, but it's actually described as a community centre with a court room on the first floor. So as you can see, the purpose the purpose of the court as being simply dispensing justice is actually almost seen as an addition to the court being a community center. And what do I mean by that? Well, you can have all kinds of community events supported by the court. Courtroom staff can be involved with, for example, supporting or even coaching soccer teams. They can hold art exhibitions at the courtroom. They can also provide social spaces, even holding barbecues and other community events. All of these initiatives serve to reduce that fear and to improve the trust between your court and your community. Some other very briefly examples of people-centered justice activities that we're doing in the developing countries in Georgia. You're familiar with many of these: court community surveys, court accessibility improvements. But as I said, court community events are very important. And also, may I bring your attention to the next one? Court holding citizen advisory committees and boards. This is a really important way of bringing the community views and actually taking into account those views when formulating policies for the court. So, for example, holding every 2 or 3 months citizen advisory committees where maybe some community service representatives or leaders from the community would give you some feedback or even participate in the decision making even better if we can do that. And other things such as holding focus groups with students, power lunches, and even perhaps attending some community events like concerts and so on and so forth. Here we have a couple of other examples. I just want to mention very briefly of judicial engagement with your communities. That really you're probably quite familiar with. The judges shouldn't simply go out, give a lecture to the students. They should actually participate in open court days and maybe even participate in some sort of mock trials with members of the community placed in the shoes of the judge, prosecutor, defendant, and so on and so forth. So really, there are many ways in which judges too can participate in these types of events. And just a final slide from me. Why not take your court into the community? This is something that has been happening in various different places. I bring these two examples just as two contrasting sort of pictures. On the left-hand side, you have a very high-end, expensive mobile court in Abu Dhabi. Lots of money out there, very well-equipped buses, but a great idea nonetheless. You can have your hearings there. It doesn't even have to be a legal hearing. It can be simply an information campaign, for example, by court staff. On the right-hand side is an example from Australian Federal Court. It is a low-cost alternative. Judges and barristers appearing somewhere in the outback, in the bush, and everything is done on the grass. I hope I've given you some good ideas. I hope to see you soon in Singapore in 2024. I wish you all the best, and I look forward to hearing from you in due course. Thank you very much.